Okay, guys, I've got a little story for y'all. So several years ago, I quit a full-time remote job because my employer wouldn't let me work while traveling abroad. And I know that sounds super dramatic, but bear with me and I'll give you guys the full story. But first, my name is Kristen Metter. I am a CPA and founder of an accounting firm called Gradient Accounting, where we help digital nomads with tax and accounting questions. But I also am really passionate about inspiring people to get out there and travel and to see the world and to not fall into the American dream, quote unquote, to keep their options open. So I'm really excited to chat with you guys today, especially about this extremely relevant topic of, should I tell my employer that I am wanting to work while traveling abroad? And I feel as though because I'm a certified public accountant, I am uniquely qualified to answer this question, and it's actually one that I get asked quite a bit. So I've got some good advice coming up for you guys. Back to my story of me quitting my job. This was in 2020, and really it was before the COVID-19 pandemic had been fully fleshed out. So the nature of remote work was a bit different back then. At that point in time, I had already gotten a taste of the digital nomad lifestyle. I took a gap year in 2018 and traveled the world and did some freelance work, but after that was over, I rehomed myself in the state of Tennessee. And I had been pretty much living full-time in the state of Tennessee and doing very little travel, and got this awesome remote job that was in my industry and really the dream job for me. And my employer was awesome. But at that point in time, I realized, okay, well, I'm working fully remote, so I could do the digital nomad thing again. I could keep my home base in Tennessee and do some travel abroad. That's what led me to asking them if I could travel while working remote. And at the end of my story, everything worked out fine, but I'm excited to go into the what I did right in the situation, and most importantly, the what I did wrong, so you guys can learn from my mistakes. So before I get into all of the things that I did wrong in that decision-making process to leave my job, let's talk about what I did right. First and foremost, I asked the question. I think some people let fear hold them back from even asking. And realistically, when we think about that, we've got to think about what is the worst that's going to happen. And the worst that's going to happen is they're going to say no. And you already know that's the case. And what's not going to happen is they're not going to say no. And by the way, for asking that question, you are fired. That's not realistic. I think that's kind of your mind going into doom and gloom mode, but I don't think that is ever going to be the case. So ask the question, and likely your employer will have to get back to you about it, right? They'll have to think about it. They may have to talk to their human resources department if they have one. So ask the question and don't be afraid if traveling abroad while working is really something you want to do. Now, here's where you get into, well, should I just start doing it and not tell my employer? And that's where the decision gets a little bit more murky. I know people personally who do that. They travel internationally, they're digital nomads, and their employer thinks they're still sitting in their home in the US. And that's not the case. And it works for them, but I feel personally like for me, that may not have worked. And for you, there's, kind of some other considerations before just going abroad and not telling your employer. And so first and foremost, you really have to think about how long you can really keep up that farce. What are your company's cybersecurity controls? Do you do a lot of video conferences? Do you have close relationships with your colleagues? Because all of those things will make it really hard to maintain that lie. So for me personally, it just wasn't in my nature to be a rule breaker. I'm a rule follower, so there were some ethical considerations I had too that made me not want to do that or to go that route. But the other thing to consider is your employment contract. Definitely before you just go move abroad, and if you're not going to tell your employer, make sure you're looking at that employment contract to see that you're not doing anything outside or to break that contract, right? So have a scan through that too. But all things considered, I really want to encourage you to have the conversation with your employer and not to be afraid to ask. It's going to give you a lot of clarity, and it's going to help you to not live in fear, quote unquote, that they're going to find you out. So back to my story, here is what I did wrong in the situation. When my employer said, no, sorry, I just said, it's okay, I guess I'm gonna leave. So I quit after that. I didn't ask more questions. And so if I was you, what I would do is really find out the why behind the no. And that can be for various reasons, but for many of us, it's tax related, right? So your employer doesn't want to go through the hassle of looking up or complying with any tax requirements in any other states or, God forbid, any other countries. That is the case for a lot of people. And when you get hired by your employer, they registered to be an employer in your state of domicile. And domicile is a fancy tax word for residency. So they register in your state to be an employer, and from there they comply with all of the tax and legal requirements in that state. And even if you live in a zero income tax state, your employer still has to do that registration and keep up with that paperwork. So they're already doing that for you if you're a traditional W-2 employee, and they don't want to have to figure out how to do that in another country, like I said. So instead of just leaving it very open-ended for them, you should be prepared to present them with a rebuttal against the tax conversation, right? So you may think about saying something like, hey, employer, I want to do a trial run of living in Spain and working remotely for 1 month. I'm really excited about all of the great skills that doing something like that is going to give me. I think it'll give me a lot of professional and personal confidence and will be really great for my mental health. So because of that, I know you may have questions about what that's going to look like from a tax perspective. So I just want you to know that nothing is going to change on your end. I'm going to still be domiciled in the state of Tennessee, and I will have my permanent address and mailing address still in Tennessee. So that is my domicile for all tax and legal purposes. And I will make sure I comply with all company policies while abroad, and I will make sure that I'm present for all obligations and still work my normal U.S. hours. As you can see, that conversation sounds a lot better than just, can I work abroad? Is that okay? Right? You've given them some solutions to the questions that they're going to have. So that is one really great thing to consider. Now, along with the tax thing, you may also realize that your employer has other concerns like cybersecurity or legal, etc. And one of those concerns can even be just setting a precedent, right? So they probably don't want other employees to follow suit. And I find that these concerns are bigger in big corporations. So with a big corporation, they're really going to be very sensitive to stick to all of their policies. So you do have more wiggle room and negotiation room if you do work for a small to mid-sized company. And just a word on the cybersecurity aspect, I would make sure I'm really familiar with my company's cybersecurity rules and policies to make sure that you can still stay compliant when you're abroad, and just let them know that. So that is one big thing I did wrong, is I didn't poke further into the why behind the no. So let's say that you've properly addressed your employer's fears about working and traveling abroad, and there's still a hard no. Well, you're not completely out of options. One thing you could consider is asking them to change your status from being an employee to being an independent contractor. As an independent contractor, your employer isn't allowed to dictate the when and the how behind your work. So they really, at that point, they could prefer that you don't work abroad, but they can't fully control that at that point. By asking them to become an independent contractor, the pro is you can then get the legal and tax monkey off of their back, because as an independent contractor, your employer isn't required to withhold any taxes or be as compliant with tax obligations as if you were a full-time employee. But also, you can really kind of just have the freedom, if you want to at that point, to renegotiate your employment with them, right? So if you were working full-time and maybe you want to drop to 25 hours a week, as an independent contractor, it's kind of the perfect way to renegotiate some things. Also, your pay, likely at that point, they're going to move you on to a retainer payment or an hourly payment that you can continue to negotiate. The big cons to being an independent contractor are you'll likely lose any company's supported benefits like your health insurance or any 401k match, because most likely those aren't going to be offered to independent contractors. and you may also lose any ability to get paid time off or sick days. You'll likely also lose the ability to work on the company's device. So if you use a company computer and any other company equipment, they may ask that you give that back to them and just work on your own device. So there are a few cons to consider there, but ultimately the independent contractor / freelancer route works well for a lot of people. And I really enjoyed that when I was a digital nomad. So that's one thing to consider. So if you maybe have already had the conversation of, can I work abroad remotely with your employer, and it didn't go so well, don't be afraid to revisit it, because policies change, companies change, and the world we lived in has changed. And a lot of companies are specifically trying to attract digital nomad talent to work with them. So revisit the conversation, obviously have your answers and solutions more fully fleshed out, and don't be afraid to really ask for what you want, because I promise living the remote work and travel lifestyle is so rewarding and so worth it once you have the full approval of your employer to do so. I hope these tips helped, and I hope you enjoyed my story and do as I say, not as I did. Thank you guys for being here.